In 2020, the Film and Whiskey podcast nearly came to a violent end with this review of a movie.
In 2022, we try 3 whiskeys from a craft Virginia distillery.
This is Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, The Revisit.
Welcome to the Film and Whiskey podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
This week we are giving you another special bonus episode. This is one that we do every season. It's called The Revisit, where we revisit a movie, a review from the annals of film and whiskey lore. We've put out a lot of episodes, Brad, and I don't expect people to go back through all 300 of them, I think, at this point.
Yeah, it's quite a few.
So even though it's only been, chronologically 2 years since we've done Eternal Sunshine, I mean, that was way back in season 2. We've watched a lot of movies since then. We have both changed as people since then. This review originally came out in February of 2020. So pre-pandemic, the world was a different place, Brad.
It was, and I was still the same miserly old soul.
I was going to say, our petty arguments, I look back on them now and I'm like, how quaint, like
that was before I didn't see you for a year.
Right, exactly. What a time when we could just argue over Eternal Sunshine.
Wow.
This was one of the most violently opposed moments of our friendship. The history of Bob Book and Brad G's friendship. You gave this movie a 2.5 out of 10, Brad.
Yeah, this and Taco Bell.
Yeah, we've told the Taco Bell story elsewhere on the podcast. It's not getting revisited today. We're revisiting Eternal Sunshine. So what we're doing is we're watching the movie again. We're going to see if Brad has changed his mind any, if I've changed my mind any. I believe I gave this movie a 9.5 the last time we watched it. I did go back and listen to a bit of the episode from last time around, but I didn't want to listen to the whole thing because I didn't want it to like taint what I'd say today. So if I do get repetitive from the last time, I apologize. I wanted to get a picture of what Brad's main argument against the movie is. So I have that in mind. I have prepared myself to combat that again. But I just finished watching this movie like 30 minutes ago, Brad. So it's still really fresh at the top of my mind. When did you watch it?
On Thursday, and today's Sunday. So
okay, so it's been a couple
4
days
ago.
You've been ruminating.
I have. I've been percolating.
Well, let's jump right into it, man. I don't want to spoil final scores, but if we're just talking like initial impressions, has anything about this changed your opinion on the second viewing?
I think that there are not many movies out there that are a 2.5 out of 10. Like it's a special spot.
Cats,
Bohemian Rhapsody, like those level of movies are 2 to 3 out of 10. Eternal Sunshine is not that.
Sure,
I was in a very special place, I think. Honestly, the only other time in this podcast history I can think of where I was as angry about a movie was the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, where I just literally, bro, I just remember I was like, I don't know, 3 hours into the movie, and I pulled up like, how much time was left, and there was still 4 hours, and I was just like, anger just filled my soul. And I think Eternal Sunshine is the only other time I felt that frustrated. And yet this time I just took it out on the final score. I don't think that this movie is a 2.5. I think it's better than that. I still don't like it.
Okay. Now, I will say there are moments where I watch a movie that is well received and it just doesn't work for me. But I don't think I've ever watched a movie that is that I can at least acknowledge is well made, or that I see the intention behind. And it is such a colossal failure that I would give it a 2.5. So,
yeah,
I went to see this movie a few weeks ago. It's the new movie by David O. Russell called Amsterdam. And that movie was a failure of all failures. It was so bad that at multiple points I was like, I should get up and walk out. Like, I'm really not paying anything for this movie. I should just leave. I started falling asleep at one point, and then I like coaxed myself back awake, and I looked at my phone clock. I was the only person in the theater. I was like, there's 20 minutes left. I can do it. That movie I gave a 3 out of 10. So like to give something a 2.5 has to, like you said, it has to be a Cats level, a catastrophe. Catastrophe. Yes. You could tell that I was trying to avoid saying that. But I couldn't think of another.
Back at the last second.
So we're at least above a 2.5. Let's just kind of jump right into performances. I think you had an issue with not the performances themselves, but the characters in this movie last time around. Separating out the characters from the performances. When you look at Jim Carrey and Kate Winslet, what did you think about the way that they portrayed these characters?
I think that the characters as written and the characters as portrayed are just kind of ridiculous and wildly overplayed.
Okay.
Like Jim Carrey is a sad sack, lonely human being, and he just hams that up at every single moment of the existence of his character.
It's so funny to use the phrase hamming it up, though, because like the character is the opposite of hamming it up. But I know what you're saying. Like he really leans into how can I be the most morose version of this character at every turn? Exactly.
Like hamming it up would normally be what Kate Winslet does in this movie. But I think that it's just the idea of overplaying the character. And he just overplays the morosely sad, lonely, introverted individual. And I just find it ridiculous. I am married to an introvert. I know many introverts. This is a caricature of an introvert, and I don't enjoy the performance.
Okay, now having said that, the moments in the movie where they're supposed to be a level of absurdity, like where they go hide in his childhood memories and he's behaving like a 4-year-old.
Yeah.
Did those moments work better for you than the morose moments because he's doing something different?
Yeah, 100%. Okay. Like there's a very few parts of this movie where I feel like the what's the MacGuffin? Like there's very few points where I feel like the MacGuffin is clever, and like that scene is one of them. Where they take it in an unexpected direction and use it to help explain the backstory of Joel, Jim Carrey's character.
Yeah.
Where I'm like, oh yeah, like this I can get down with. And I enjoyed that moment where he's trying to straddle the line of like, I know I'm an adult, but I'm emotionally a 4-year-old right now. And I'm trying to straddle that line. There's a few moments like that throughout the film where I'm like, oh, okay. Like, yes, you are acting now and not just not in a very one-note performance.
I think that's kind of why this movie still works for me. The more I think about it, because, I touched on this in the original episode, but the writer of this movie, Charlie Kaufman, has become very famous in Hollywood for his elaborate kind of mindfuck of a script. Every script he makes is this like wild, off the wall. Only he could think of something this crazy. And honestly, Eternal Sunshine is probably the most conventional script out of all the scripts he's written. And it tells the most, in a weird sense, the most linear story of all of them. And I love that they use the opportunity to delve into those weird, absurd moments of, I'm a 4-year-old now. But because it actually says something, and I think it says something kind of profound, that this whole movie boils down to how do we communicate with each other? What does the lack of communication look like? Why would we rather cut people off than be vulnerable with each other, than open ourselves up? And I love the fact that, she's asking Joel, hide me somewhere where they'll never find me. Hide me somewhere where they would never expect to be able to erase the memory of. Hide me in your humiliation. And so they go back to these moments in his childhood. And it's like, it's so sad in a way to think of the fact that she's never been exposed to those memories before. Like, he's never opened up to her in the whole, I think it's a 2-year relationship that they mention. And I really love that it's a reflection on, if he had just opened himself up in this way to her to begin with, they wouldn't be going through this at all. And I think it says a lot about, I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is I think that there is a universal message inside this movie about two very quirky characters.
Yeah. And they do have a few moments where they communicate that really well. Like, honestly, one of the best lines of the movie is when Jim Carrey says to Kate Winslet's character, it's something along the lines of, just because you're talking all the time doesn't mean you're actually communicating.
Yes, yeah.
And I'm like, that is one of the snarkiest, most biting comments you can ever make. And yet, like, if a professor was like teaching on communication and said that from the lectern, everybody would be like, "Oh, wow, that's really deep." like that's really like just because you're talking all the time doesn't mean you're communicating. The problem that I have is Kaufman has no subtlety, and he couldn't create a character that like mostly talks all the time. He had to create the most, like, I'm not necessarily calling her this because she ruins everything, but like she puts the manic in Manic Pixie Dream Girl. Like, yeah, like Kate Winslet is the most psychotic character, and Jim Carrey is the most introverted character that you could ever imagine, who never communicates. Oh, you always write in your stupid little books and you never actually say anything to me. And I'm like, oh yeah, he's the guy who just writes in his journal and draws pictures, right. and it's like, it feels like a Clint Eastwood version of two human beings. There's no subtlety, that like they are just, I get what you're saying. It's well written.
I have thought about the Manic Pixie Dream Girl thing because, that really came to pass with 500 Days of Summer. And I look back on this and I thought about that phrase as I was watching it. And I was like, I don't know if I'd call her the Manic Pixie Dream Girl because she's not a dream girl. Like, they go
Manic
to great
Pixie Nightmare Girl.
Yeah. And they go to great pains, especially at the front, 40 minutes of the movie. As I'm watching it, I'm just like, this is an entirely unpleasant human being. And I don't know why he would want to be with her. And then, of course, as the movie goes on, and I think this is part of why it's so brilliantly written and so brilliantly constructed. The happy memories don't start coming out until midway through the film. And I think that says so much about the way that when we are at odds with someone, when we're fighting with someone, especially in a marital relationship or a serious romantic relationship, the things that are on top of mind are, the awful things that you're going through. And it takes you so long to get down to the root of like, why am I with this person? Why am I actually happy? And you start to see Clementine for who she actually is, or who Joel actually thinks she is, not just like the vindictive bitch that he thinks she is, but why they actually did make a good pair. And yet, and I think this is the most brilliant little directorial touch, the last shot of the movie, after they have their happy ending where they commit to each other and say like, I'm going to take on your baggage again. And maybe we'll keep going through this and maybe we won't, but like, I'd rather go through the bad stuff than try to forget about it. And then they cut to, you think it's a happy ending, and they cut to a shot of them frolicking on the beach again. And then that shot replays 3 times. And it's like, oh, maybe they are doomed to keep repeating this cycle. Maybe they aren't good for each other. And I still think that the overall message of the movie is like, so what if they're not good for each other? Like, it is still better. It's better to be human. It's more human to embrace the messiness of it than to try to erase it. And I don't know, man. I still think this is a really well written, well constructed movie in a way that apparently you don't.
It's so incredibly pretentious.
Oh, come on.
I'm pulling the pretentious card, Bob. This, just because you're saying a lot of stuff all at once doesn't mean you're actually communicating.
You can't use
Charlie
the movie's
Kaufman.
own line against it. Come on, man.
I'm just saying, like, he throws all of these fancy tricks at you, but really this story, there's not much to the message of this story. it feels like he's just a horny 20-something jumping up and down on the sheets in his underwear, more so than an actual deep thinker who's drawing pictures in his notebook. Like, I just, when I work my way through this film, I find myself thinking, like, this is just the story of people who aren't good for each other and are trying to justify why they're together. And, like, that's fine. Like, that's a common story to the human existence, but it's not a very deep or interesting one to me.
Interesting. Huh.
And I think that's the struggle for me, is I don't think that this movie actually says very much at all. And all of the choices that, you know, Kaufman as a writer and who's the directors?
Michel Gondry.
Yeah, that, like, Gondry as a director makes all these capital C choices, but the message of the movie doesn't support the decision.
Interesting.
And I think that for me, if you're gonna move in a really artsy, like, stylized direction, I think it needs to be supported, like, with a solid foundational message that is deep and impactful and interesting and meaningful and nuanced and is teased out well throughout the story. For me, there was nothing that was nuanced or teased out about this movie.
All right. Well, we will let that point stand for the time being before we come back from break and I just annihilate you. But let's try these 3 whiskeys, Brad. I think this is a good place for a little break.
Yeah.
So we're trying 3 whiskeys today from KO Distilling in Manassas, Virginia. This is a distillery that's been around for about a decade now. They are distilling their own product on site, and 2 of the 3 samples that we're trying today do come from their own distillate. One is sourced. We'll talk about that one when we get to it. We have a bottled and bond bourbon, a bottled and bond rye, and a cask strength bourbon to get to, Brad. So what are you thinking? Which one should we start with today?
Let's move through the 2 bottled and bonds. We can do the bourbon and then the rye, and then we'll get into that high rye bourbon that's cask strength.
Yeah, so let's start with the bourbon. This is a 70% corn, 20% wheat, 10% barley bourbon. So I know we're drinking a high rye cask strength bourbon later, but there's no rye in this at all. It's a wheated bourbon, Brad. This is aged for at least 4 years, distilled on site at KO Distilling. What are you picking up on this, man?
Yeah, it's a really nice, pleasant nose. You definitely get some of that graininess that if they had put this out at 2 years would have been overwhelming.
Agreed.
But as it is, it's a pleasant undertone to the greater pop of, like, cherry and a little bit of caramel and a little bit of vanilla. It's a really nice soft nose that I enjoy.
Yeah, and I think the palate kind of is the same thing, but maybe amplified a little bit more. I really like that this is a wheated bourbon. Like you said, it gives it those notes of, obviously it has the caramel from the corn, but it has that cherry cola note that we love so much with our wheated bourbons. And then it does have that hint of youthfulness to it still, Brad. And like you said, if this was 2 years old, this would be a pretty almost raw tasting grain forward craft bourbon. At 4 years, still a little youthful, but it's almost like that youthful note or the grainy note is in addition to a really well-rounded wheat bourbon. I don't know if that makes sense. It doesn't seem like this is a young bourbon. It just seems like they've added one additional note to our tasting, and it is that youthful graininess. I actually like this quite a bit.
Yeah, it's pretty solid. I think as I move through the palate and the finish, you get a lot of the classic notes. You get caramel, you get vanilla. It turns a little bit oaky at the end. I think that the barley starts to come through at the very end of the finish, where it kind of sits for a little while. And there's a little bit of that cherry wheat taste coming through. I don't know if I would say this is anything to write home about, but if you were local to the area, I could see myself really enjoying, like, having this solid of a whiskey nearby.
Oh, for sure. Like, this is, for craft whiskey, this is really, really good. And yes. I'm a big fan already. So let's try this rye. I know we're moving at a little bit of a quicker pace today, but that's because these revisit episodes tend to be a bit shorter. So we're moving into the bottled in bond rye. As I pull up the mash bill here, this is a 100% Virginia grown rye. So it's not cut with any other grain. Brad, what do you think of the 100% rye?
It smells like rye. Fun fact, it tastes like rye. And just to throw it out there, it finishes like a rye.
All right, so 4 years old. Is it as youthful, do you think, as the bourbon was?
Yes, a little bit more so.
Oh,
I think that this one is incredibly grainy. I guess I shouldn't say grainy because that might imply that there's more than one grain. This one literally just tastes like a loaf of rye bread.
It's not sweet, but I actually don't know if I'd call this one youthful. And again, maybe I'm just more sensitive to ryes because I don't quite like them as much as you do, Brad. This just reminds me, you're right. I mean, like, it's rye forward, but I think if this was younger, this would be a lot to deal with. At 4 years old, I actually really don't mind this at all. And it's got some really like black coffee notes for me. It's almost tannic in a way. I really like it. It leans more into that sort of like mint, dill, rye grain side of a rye, as opposed to the more caramely notes that you sometimes get. Man, I don't know. I think I'm going to differ with you on this one. I like this a lot.
No, I was not saying that I don't like it. I actually really like this.
Yeah.
I think it tastes like rye all the way through, and that's a unique experience. I don't feel like there's many ryes that I smell it and go, oh, yep, that is 100% a rye. And then I taste it, and it's got all of those nice, spicy rye notes mixed with some of those seasonings. Like you said, those dills, the little bit of peppermint even, a little bit of parsley almost. And then on the finish, I'm like, oh, well, yep, more rye. And I enjoy the entire experience immensely. I'm still fascinated. I don't know if I've said this before. Still to this day, even after having drank so much rye whiskey and really loved it, I hate rye bread. I had it again the other day and was just like, this is disgusting. Who would want to eat this? And then I drink this whiskey that like kind of tastes the same, and I'm like all about it. So I don't know, man. It's weird.
I love that you keep trying it though. Like your opinion is very well established on rye bread, but you're like, you know what? Let's give it another try.
Gonna go down this trail again. It's like when you go and watch 2001 for the 17th time. And I'm like, Bob, I know you're not going to like it.
Yeah. All right. Last one is the Bare Knuckle High Rye Bourbon. This is a cask strength bourbon. Now, Brad, from what I could find online, this is distilled by MGP. This is a 6-year bourbon. However, I know that they've been distilling their own stuff for long enough at KO that at some point they may be switching over to their own distillate for this 6-year bourbon. I'm looking at a review of the product online that someone wrote last year, 2021, and at that point, it was distilled by MGP. The media sample that we have has quite a bit of information on its label, but it does not tell me where it was distilled. So I'm going to go ahead and guess, for consistency's sake, this was distilled by MGP. This is aged for 6 years. Like I said, it's 127.59 proof. Brad, what are you picking up on this bad boy?
Can I just say before we get into notes, every time we talk about MGP, my brain, like somewhere deep in my subconscious, just sees the opening title card for MGM and like sees the roaring lion. And so now at this point, I've just like assumed that the logo for MGP is a roaring lion.
That's hilarious, dude.
There's a reason MGP makes so much whiskey and sources so much. They just make a really killer whiskey.
Yeah, this smells like caramel corn. Like there's a saltiness to it. And I'm going to be honest here, and I don't feel bad saying this because this is an MGP product and not something distilled by KO. For a second, I was like, this smells a little bit like piss. And then as I started nosing it a little more, I was like, oh, it's not piss, but it is briny. And then all of a sudden, like the caramel notes came through, and I thought
you were going to say, oh, it's not piss, it's caramel corn.
It is. That's exactly what it is.
Easy to get confused, Bob.
I'm telling you, dude, it was like buttered popcorn and then caramel. And I was like, okay. So my mind went from like briny pea to buttered popcorn to caramel corn.
I just feel like you're standing at the toilet in the movie theater holding the popcorn in your left hand.
Just sniffing the bucket while peeing. It's like, oh, that's the stuff right there.
Oh, that's the best tasting journey you have ever taken us on, Bob. Thank you for that.
So anyway, in a weird way, I don't dislike it. It just it took my mind a minute for the synapses to fire and trace the journey from briny urine to caramel corn.
You need to just go onto the palate, man. I need a minute.
It tastes kind of like the buttered popcorn Jelly Belly.
Yep. Oh yeah, dude.
Which is kind of like that's what it's reminding me of. It's not so much caramel corn as it is like it's sweet, or kettle corn, I guess, if that's what you want to go for. But it has that salty butteriness to it as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say it literally tastes for me. There's just enough graininess that it. Have you ever gotten like literally like ripped the toast out of the toaster and then just slathered way too much butter on it?
Absolutely. Every day of my life.
Like, the initial layer melts and you can't see it, and then you slather a whole nother layer on that doesn't melt and you can just see all the butter. I feel like I'm eating that piece of toast if it was salted butter.
So here's what I'll say. And I know that I probably made this sound unpalatable with my initial nosing note there.
I wonder why.
There are a number of people who don't like the buttered popcorn Jelly Belly. Like, it's a very divisive bean, and I really love it.
Are you on a subreddit of just Jelly Bellies? Like daily?
Yeah. I participate in many polls. But seriously,
Okay.
I've had Jelly Bellies before, and people have been like, ew, those are gross. It's like the popcorn ones and the licorice ones. People don't like them. So if you're not a fan of that Jelly Belly, I don't know if this is the whiskey for you, but for me, I really love that combination of salty and sweet and buttery. I think this is a really, really good whiskey, Brad. It's probably the best of the three here. But with that said, I think that the stuff that KO is distilling themselves is in a completely different wheelhouse than this. It's not as if they're competing in any way with each other.
No, not at all. The bourbon that they are making obviously is not competing. It's, if anything, it would be considered a high wheat bourbon.
Right.
So they're in a completely different wheelhouse. I think that this is an example of a distillery that is confident in their own product, but also want to give their local geography a great experience while they're waiting the 4 years for their own bottled and bond stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm a big fan, man. I really feel like we had kind of a flight of whiskeys here. They were all very different from each other. They had their own things going on. Super unique. I'm a fan.
Yeah, I would say it's a pretty easy knockout for me, Bob.
All right, man. Let's get back into talking about Eternal Sunshine. What do you say?
I'm ready, man. Let's get back at it. I'm putting the gloves back on.
All right, Brad, I don't have too much more to say about this movie. I would like to hear, this is a pretty big cast, and we've only talked about the two main characters. What did you think of the supporting performances? Was there anybody that stood out to you this time through, for better or for worse?
I do remember thinking the first time I saw this that the character played by, I believe it's Tom Wilkinson.
Yeah.
I really like Dr. Mierzwak, or whatever it is. I think that the story behind the scenes of him erasing the memory of Mary, his assistant, and his wife leaving him, and like all this stuff, like that storyline was way more fascinating than anything that happened between Jim Carrey and Kate Winslet. I think that the best moment of the movie, the most honest, like raw, authentic moment of the movie is when Mark Ruffalo is like promising Kirsten Dunst that he didn't know about the memory wipe between, her and the doctor, and that, he would never have done anything if he did, like he would have told her. And then he looks at her as she's like leaving, because she's very clearly like just over the whole thing. And he just says to her, hey, like, Mary, I really liked you. And that is the single most authentic moment in this entire film.
You're correct.
And I loved that. Big fan.
So here's why I love that subplot, is because what is happening in that subplot illuminates what's happening with Jim Carrey and Kate Winslet. Like, Elijah Wood's character is a piece of shit, and Tom Wilkinson's character, it turns out, is a piece of shit. And in some ways, Mark Ruffalo's character is kind of like an accessory to shit. He's not quite a piece of shit, but he's almost there. But what you have there is the sort of pinnacle of the ethical shittiness of this company. Like, you did this to your own assistant. And in the script, Brad, I actually went online and read a little bit of the script before we hopped on tonight, and they didn't include this in the movie. He actually got her pregnant and convinced her to go get an abortion. And so they didn't use that in the movies. And I'm glad they didn't go Bob, there. I think that would have been...
Get me to like this movie more.
Well, so that's what I'm saying. I'm glad they didn't use that in the movie. I think that would have been kind of a bridge too far. But you have that moment with Mark Ruffalo where he's just heartbroken as he walks away. And that's the last you see of him. But what that moment tells you is like, yeah, he just struck out with this girl that he really liked. And everyone's life is a little bit affected by this thing that this doctor did. But it's still better for them to have those memories. Like, Kirsten Dunst is leaving without even the dignity of having the memory of that horrible relationship. And I just really love that this movie time and time again affirms that, like, yeah, life is complex and life is hard. And there are moments that you probably want to forget. But the beautiful thing about being human is that we have those mixed emotions. Yeah. And Brad, honestly, like, you know, I wasn't going to spring this on you, but I've been thinking as we've talked about this the whole time. On our regular episodes, we do this thing called Make It a Double, where we pair it up with another movie. And I've thought about a few movies that I would pair this up with that I think would go well with the vibe of this movie or whatever. But honestly, when it comes down to what I think the main message of this movie is, I actually think this pairs up really well with the Pixar film Inside Out, which... You know, the core message of that movie is, well, I said core, but like, you know, it's about core memories and how you have to have the sad memories to make the happy memories mean something. And part of being human and part of growing up is learning how to have these complex emotions where there's, sadness intermingled with the happiness. This morning, my wife and I and our family had our last Sunday at the church that we've been serving for 5 years. And they had a beautiful little ceremony for my wife. And, you know, everybody gave her a standing ovation and it was really beautiful. But it was a very bittersweet moment. And we hugged a lot of people and there were a lot of tears and there was a lot of, confessing on everybody's part of like what we did and what we hadn't done and what we wish we had done. And it was a really beautiful, bittersweet day. And my son took it kind of hard. It's the only church he's ever gone to. And he says he's going to miss his friends. And, we're going to find a church that's closer to our home now. And I had to teach him on the way home what the word bittersweet meant. And honestly, Brad, I wasn't even thinking about the fact that I just had this experience today. But I think I really love that the message of this movie ultimately is that the bittersweet is what makes us human. And that is something to be celebrated and something to be praised. And I think that as weird and absurd and wacky as this movie is sometimes, it really does have something to say. And I know that you came away from this movie thinking that it didn't have much to say, but I found it really beautiful and kind of poetic how it says all of those things in a movie where it doesn't have to explicitly verbalize any of those things. So I'll jump into final scores, man. I'm going to stick at a 9.5. I was about 40 minutes into this movie and thinking that I might bring it down a peg or two, but by the time I walked away from it, it's nearly perfect to me. And a lot of the reason that I think it's nearly perfect is because it plays so well on my emotions. So I'm sticking at a 9.5, and I'm anxious to see how far up from a 2.5 you've come this time around.
2.65. No, I mean, I love the way that this movie has spoken to you, Bob. And I think that that's the beauty of film and cinema, is that the way it can connect to us. I also think it's great to use, a highly personal recent example that you're not allowed to argue against. So bravo, man. Way to use that in your favor.
Check and mate.
I think that for me, one of the most interesting messages I took away from the movie this time through rather than last time, I think that this movie actually has a lot to say about the danger of using consent as a be-all, end-all in our society. A few months ago, I read this article from The Atlantic, and I don't remember the exact title, but it essentially was like, we need a better rule to follow in our sexual encounters than consent. And it basically talked about, like, just because we say we want something right now doesn't necessarily mean we're going to like the fact that we did what we did later. And watching this movie, like, one of the key elements is that, you know, Joel and Clementine and even Mary, they hear themselves giving consent to this operation played back to them on a cassette. And it just made me really think about the fact that, like, if the only thing we have guiding our thoughts in any given moment are our internal feelings, I feel like we're going to be really left lacking in our world.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to interrupt you. I think I do want to just offer a point of clarification that what you're saying is not that consent is bad, but that the short-sightedness of saying yes in the moment and not realizing the ramifications of saying yes and the impulsivity of that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. 100%. Like, yes, consent is very important.
Clarification. I feel like we need to
clarification. But I don't think that it should be the only standard by which we engage in life. And I'm not just talking about sexual encounters. I'm talking about life. Like, we shouldn't just consider, oh, well, they consented, so everything was okay and above board. Nothing was immoral about the thing that we did. We're okay. We're good. I'm like, well, no, like, we need more standards than, at this moment, I feel like I'm okay with what's happening. We need something outside of us to help us make decisions. Because if left to our own devices, humans don't make great decisions pretty consistently. I think we can all agree on that. So that was an interesting take that I don't know if they meant for this movie to have as a takeaway, but it's something I noticed this watch through. So yeah, I think that this movie works better than any movie that's a 2.5 out of 10. I still don't like it. I still think that it's a whole lot to do about not that much. I will give it a 5.5 out of 10, Bob.
I think that is, like, entirely too low, but that also means that you have raised your score like a full 3 points out of 10.
Yeah, that's 30% higher.
That's a big jump.
Yeah. But I've put it more properly into I think this is a garbage movie, but it's not Bohemian Rhapsody or Cats.
Yeah. Yeah, there's certain categories, like, you know, in my own mind where I'm like, all right, this is a poorly made movie that doesn't work. That's like a 2.5. Or like, this is a poorly made movie, but by God, I still enjoyed it. That's like a 5.5. Then there's also like, this is a well-made movie that I think is bad. And that's the hardest one to do. Not even just like, it didn't work for me, but like, I actually disagree with almost everything. Almost every choice made in this movie doesn't work for me. And those are really hard to score out because it's like, I can't score it too high because I literally don't think it's good. But it's like, damn it, I also have to acknowledge that even if it's not my cup of tea,
there's certain elements that
yeah. So I mean,
that's kind of where I'm at with this movie, man.
I applaud you for being honest enough to put it at a 5.5.
Yeah.
2.5 was egregious. I had to call you out on that,
man. I was feeling some kind of way about it.
Yeah, like, seriously, I would encourage people to go back and listen to that episode. I have never heard Brad come out of the gate. Like, he seemed angry at me for making him waste his time on this movie.
You know what? Instead of like pulling clips from the movie and playing them periodically, you should just pull clips from that episode and play it interspersed throughout this episode.
I probably will. All right, so this is the first of 2 episodes we're releasing this week. We're taking the week off for Thanksgiving, but you're getting 2 brand new bonus episodes. So this one's coming out today, Monday. On Thursday, Thanksgiving, we will be having our 3rd annual Hanksgiving episode.
Hanksgiving.
What movie? Oh, yeah. We'll be watching A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, Tom Hanks's 2019 Mr. Rogers biopic. What a great movie. I'm excited to talk about that one.
I'm excited for it too, man.
So yeah, as you are prepping your Thanksgiving meal, make sure to tune in on Thursday. Throw that one on in the background. We'll be back next Monday with another regularly scheduled episode. But until then, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.